Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the really fascinating world of oil reserves.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
It is. Think of this as your quick, but hopefully pretty comprehensive guide. We want you to understand what they are, where they're located globally, and some of the key things that shape how we define them and maybe how long we think they'll last.
And we've dug through quite a few sources for you. We've got lists of proven reserves from Wikipedia, definitions analysis from Investopedia, environmental points from the EIA,
right?
The technical side from BP's Statistical Review, peak oil discussions, also Investopedia strategic reserves.
Oh, also in Investopedia?
Yep, then again. And an academic paper from econjournals.com looking at what drives those oil prices up and down.
So our mission today is basically to pull out the key stuff from all that, give you a clear picture of this, essential resource without totally drowning you in data.
Exactly. Let's try and make sense of it.
Okay, let's unpack this right at the start. What are oil reserves, really?
Okay, so at its core, the definition of proven oil reserves, and that's mostly what we'll talk about, it refers to the quantities of petroleum we estimate with a pretty high degree of confidence.
High confidence? Like how high?
Usually 90% or greater chance that we can commercially recover them from known spots, known reservoirs under today's economic conditions. You'll see this definition pretty consistently.
Okay, so it's not just about, how much oil is physically down there. That commercially recoverable bit sounds pretty important.
It's crucial, absolutely. And that's why these proven reserve numbers aren't fixed. They're dynamic.
How so?
Well, think about it. Oil that's maybe too expensive to get out today could suddenly become worth it if, say, oil prices shoot up. Or if we develop some new technology that makes extraction cheaper or more efficient.
Got examples.
Yeah, good ones are Canada's oil sands back in 2003 and Venezuela's heavy oil a bit later, late 2000s. Suddenly, huge amounts of oil that were technically known, just too hard or costly to extract, got reclassified as proven. Because the economics or the tech changed. Their reserve numbers jumped significantly.
Okay, so that explains why these numbers can change. Now, you mentioned sources sometimes disagree, like OPEC versus the CIA versus oil companies. Why the differences there?
Yeah, discrepancies happen. A couple of main reasons. Sometimes it's about what they're counting.
Like different types of oil.
Exactly. Does the estimate include unconventional stuff like oil shale or mined oil sands or even natural gas liquids? Different organizations might have slightly different rules.
Okay.
And it's worth noting most of the data we're looking at today focuses on conventional crude oil, unless we say otherwise. Plus, subtle differences in how they define proven or the exact economic assumptions they use can also lead to slightly different numbers.
Got it. So keeping those nuances in mind, let's zoom out. Where is most of this proven oil? Who has it?
All right, the global picture. If we look at, say, 2021 data, which is a pretty recent snapshot we have across the board, a few countries consistently pop up at the top.
Although the exact order might shift a bit depending on the source, you said.
Precisely. But based on BP's 2021 figures, which Investopedia also uses, Venezuela actually leads.
Really? Venezuela?
Yep. With around 303.8 billion barrels of proven reserves. Saudi Arabia is right behind them, 297.5 billion. Then Canada, largely because of those oil sands we mentioned, at 168.1 billion.
And the U.S., where do we sit in?
According to that BP list, the U.S. was ninth, with about 68.8 billion barrels.
Okay, ninth. So Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Canada, quite concentrated.
Very concentrated. And Investopedia points out that OPEC members, as a group, estimate they hold something like 80% of the world's proven reserves.
80%? Wow. That's quite a bit of leverage.
It certainly shapes global energy markets, no question.
You mentioned a more detailed list, too. Anything interesting pop out there?
Yeah, Wikipedia has a table pulling from EIA, OPEC, BP. And while the specific numbers might vary slightly, the big picture holds. What's maybe more insightful there is a metric they sometimes include. Years of production in reserve.
What does that mean?
It basically takes the proven reserves and divides by the current annual production rate. So how long would the reserves last if they kept producing at that exact rate?
And what does that show?
Some really stark contrasts. Like Venezuela, with its massive reserves, had a figure around 925 years based on its very low 2023 production.
Whoa, 925 years.
Yeah, sounds huge, right? But compare that to Saudi Arabia, around 79 years, or the U.S., only about 15 years by that metric.
15, that sounds low.
It reflects much higher production rates relative to reserves. But the Venezuela number really drives home the point you hinted at earlier.
Yet having reserves doesn't mean you're pumping a lot of oil.
Exactly. Investopedia highlights Venezuela perfectly. Biggest reserves on paper, but their actual production collapsed due to, well, a lot of internal issues, starting around 2014. By 2020, BP's data showed they were producing only about 0.6% of the global total.
Less than 1% despite having the most reserves. That's wild.
It really shows that having the oil underground is just one piece of the puzzle. Politics, economics, infrastructure, technology, they all play a massive role in actual production.
Okay, so we know who has it, roughly, and that having it doesn't automatically mean producing it. Now, the big question. How do we figure out how long it might all last? Is there a standard way to estimate that?
Well, there's no crystal ball, obviously.
Yeah.
But a key metric used is that reserve-to-production ratio, the RP ratio we just touched on.
Right.
Investopedia defines it clearly. It's an estimate of the number of years a country's or the world's reserve base will last if production continues at the current annual rate. It's a tool companies and countries watch closely.
And globally, what's the RP number looking like now?
Investopedia puts the global estimate, as of 2024, at around 47 years.
47 years. Okay. Doesn't sound like forever.
Well, remember, that's a global average, and it assumes today's production rates stay constant, which they won't. And the picture varies a lot by region.
Ah, okay. Tell me about the regional differences.
Yeah, the trends BP tracks, discussed by Investopedia, are interesting. South and Central America. Their RP ratio shot up massively.
Why is that?
Mostly big offshore discoveries in Brazil. Their RP based on 2020 production was over 150 years.
Wow. And elsewhere.
The Middle East, historically the giant, has actually seen its RP ratio trend down. It was around 100 years back in the 90s, but closer to 80 years in 2020. Still huge, but trending lower relative to production.
And North America, you said the U.S. RP was low.
Right. North America's RP has also been sloping down, around 30 years in 2020. That's mainly because production, especially in the U.S. with shale oil, ranked up so aggressively in recent years.
Okay, so RP gives us a snapshot, but it depends heavily on current production. Let's dig a bit deeper into the definitions. BP's review mentioned different categories: proved, probable, possible.
That's right. It's about certainty. BP lays out the technical side. Proved reserves, sometimes called 1P, that's the high confidence stuff, 90% or greater probability of recovery. It's the most conservative number.
Okay.
Then you have probable reserves, or 2P. These have, statistically, a better than 50% chance of being technically and economically producible. Add proved and probable together, you get 2P reserves.
And possible.
Possible reserves, or 3P, are less certain again. A significant chance, but less than 50% of being recovered. So proved plus probable plus possible gives you the 3P estimate.
So that main proved number we usually hear quoted, it's really just the most certain slice, potentially.
Essentially, yes. It's the bedrock estimate. BP also talks about estimated ultimate recovery, or a UR. That's an estimate of the total amount of oil that might ever be recovered from a field or reservoir over its entire life. It's inherently more speculative, more subjective, and it can definitely change as we learn more about the geology or as technology improves.
Makes sense. And what are the specific criteria for oil to even be called a reserve in the first place?
According to BP, it boils down to 4 things. 1, it has to be discovered. We need to know it's there.
Obvious enough.
2, it needs to be recoverable with current or reasonably foreseeable technology.
Okay.
3, it must be commercial, meaning it's economically viable to get it out under current conditions, prices, costs, etc.
The economics again.
Always. And 4, it has to be remaining in the ground as of a specific date based on the actual development projects planned or underway.
Got it. Discovered, recoverable, commercial, remaining. One last technical bit. Recovery factor.
Ah, yes.
Huh?
That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's just the ratio or percentage of the total oil initially thought to be in place in a reservoir that we actually expect to recover.
And that varies.
Oh, hugely. Depends on the rock type, the oil's viscosity, the pressure, the technology used, all sorts of things. And interestingly, BP notes this factor can increase over the life of a field.
How?
Through things like secondary or enhanced oil recovery techniques, injecting water or gas to push more oil out, for example. This improvement is often called reserves growth, getting more out of fields we already knew about.
Okay, this is all fascinating on the resource side. But of course, getting all this oil out, it has impacts. Let's talk about the environmental side. What did the EIA source say?
Yeah, the EIA gives a balanced look. They definitely acknowledge that finding, producing, and moving crude oil, it can have negative effects. Land disturbance, marine ecosystem disruption.
Like from seismic surveys.
Right. Seismic can affect marine life. Drilling pads on land mean clearing areas, building pipelines, roads. It all has a footprint.
But technology is helping reduce that footprint, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The EIA points to several things. In exploration, using satellites, better seismic imaging like 3D and 4D, it helps pinpoint reserves more accurately, meaning fewer exploratory wells drilled, hopefully.
And the drilling itself.
Slim hole rigs that are more mobile and have a smaller surface impact. And horizontal drilling is a big one, allows a single well pad to access a much larger underground area, reducing surface disturbance.
Okay. What about fracking? That's always controversial.
Hydraulic fracturing, yes. The EIA acknowledges it's been huge for boosting U.S. production, especially from tight shale rock. But they also detail the environmental concerns.
Like what?
Big water usage is one. Transporting that water, potentially straining local sources. Then there's the chemicals used in the fracking fluid, managing those safely. And dealing with the wastewater that comes back up.
Wastewater disposal.
Yeah, it contains dissolved chemicals, salts, sometimes naturally occurring radioactive materials. Injecting it deep underground is common, but that's been linked, in some areas, to induce seismicity small earthquakes.
Right, I've heard about that. And oil spills. Still a major concern, obviously.
Absolutely. EIA notes spills happen from accidents, well, blowouts, pipeline leaks, tanker or train incidents. They can be devastating.
But are things improving there?
There's been a big push, both from regulators and industry. Post-Exxon Valdez, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, mandated double hulls for tankers in U.S. waters.
Ah, okay.
After the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf, there was a major overhaul of offshore drilling safety regulations and technologies. And there are new standards for rail tank cars, too, after some high-profile accidents involving crude oil trains. So yes, efforts are definitely being made to prevent spills and improve cleanup when they happen.
It's not all negative impact, though, right? I think I read something about old oil rigs becoming reefs.
You did. That's the Rigs to Reefs program that EIA mentions. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe.
A bit, yeah.
But when offshore platforms are decommissioned, instead of removing everything, sometimes the underwater structure, the jacket, is left in place or toppled. And surprisingly quickly, marine life colonizes it.
Like coral and stuff?
Exactly. Barnacles, coral, sponges, anemones, they attach to the structure. And that attracts fish, lots of fish. They become really productive artificial reefs.
Huh. An unexpected positive outcome.
Kind of an ecological silver lining from industrial infrastructure. Boosts local fish stocks, creates spots for fishing and diving. It's pretty neat, actually.
Okay, let's shift gears again. We've been hearing about peak oil for, well, decades, it feels like. What's the current thinking on that concept?
Yeah, peak oil. Investopedia explains the original idea well. It's based on M. King Hubbart's theory from the 1950s.
The bell curve guy.
That's the one. He predicted that oil production in any given region, and eventually the world, would follow a bell-shaped curve. It would rise, hit a maximum the peak, and then inevitably decline.
And the idea was we'd peak because we were, running out of easily accessible oil.
That was the traditional fear, yeah. Peak oil driven by geological scarcity.
But those predictions, they haven't quite panned out, have they?
Not in the way originally forecast, no. Investopedia points out that predictions of an imminent peak due to just running out have proven premature.
Why? The new tech.
Largely, yes. Hydraulic fracturing, unlocking shale oil, deep water drilling, better ways to find and extract oil. It pushed the potential peak much further out, or maybe flattened the curve. We keep finding ways to get more oil out of the ground, even from trickier places.
So is peak oil just irrelevant now?
Not exactly. The conversation has shifted. Investopedia introduces a different concept, peak oil demand.
Peak demand, meaning we stop wanting as much oil.
Precisely. The idea here is that oil production might eventually fall, not because we physically can't get it out, but because consumption drops.
Driven by what? Electric cars? Renewables?
Things like that, yes. More efficient vehicles, alternative energy sources becoming cheaper and more widespread, policy changes aimed at reducing carbon emissions. All these could lead to lower demand for oil, even if there's still plenty technically available.
Has anyone seriously considered this?
Oh, yeah. Even OPEC started discussing the possibility of peak demand a few years back. And think about 2020.
The pandemic.
Right. U.S. crude oil production actually dropped significantly then. Not because the oil wasn't there, but because demand collapsed and prices plummeted due to lockdowns. Investopedia mentions this as maybe a glimpse of what a demand-driven decline could look like, rather than a supply-driven one.
Interesting shift in perspective, from running out to not needing as much.
It's a key change in how people are thinking about the long-term future of oil, which naturally brings us to another layer of security.
Strategic reserves.
Exactly. Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or SPRs.
Okay, so what exactly are these SPRs? Why do countries keep them?
Investopedia defines them pretty clearly. They're basically government-controlled stockpiles of crude oil. The main purpose is to have a backup supply ready to release into the market if there's a major disruption.
Like a war or a natural disaster hitting production.
Exactly those kinds of things. Think of it as an insurance policy against sudden oil shortages or price spikes caused by emergencies.
And the U.S. has the biggest one.
By far. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is the world's largest. Its authorized maximum capacity is 727 million barrels.
Wow. Where do they keep all that oil?
It's stored underground in huge, hollowed-out salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Salt domes are apparently very stable and secure for long-term storage.
And the U.S. has actually used it before, right? It's not just sitting there.
Oh, definitely. It's been tapped multiple times. Investopedia mentions releases after major hurricanes like Katrina and Rita disrupted Gulf Coast production. There were releases during the first Gulf War, after the invasion of Libya, and more recently, significant releases were authorized to try and counter high gasoline prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was actually created back in the 70s because of the Arab oil embargo to prevent that kind of vulnerability again.
So it serves both a supply disruption and maybe a price stabilization role.
It can, though price stabilization is often more controversial. Its primary mandate is severe supply disruptions.
How does the U.S. SPR stack up against other countries? Do other big consumers have them?
They do. China and Japan, other major importers, also have significant strategic reserves. Getting exact, up-to-the-minute numbers can be tricky, especially for China, as they aren't always fully transparent.
But they exist.
Yes. Investopedia notes that estimates put China's reserves at maybe 40-50 days worth of their imports, while Japan, according to the International Energy Agency, holds public reserves equivalent to over 200 days of imports. So, the U.S. is biggest, but others maintain substantial stocks too.
So if the president decides, okay, we need to release oil, how does that actually happen?
Well, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act lays it out. The president can order a full drawdown if there's a severe energy supply interruption, or they can authorize a more limited release to prevent such an interruption.
And then what? Does the government just open the taps?
Essentially, yes. The Department of Energy manages the process. They can offer the oil as loans to companies, usually to be repaid with interest later, or they can sell it outright through a competitive bidding process to refiners or other buyers.
How quickly can they get the oil out?
Investopedia says that once the order is given, it takes the DOE about 13 days to run the sale, award contracts, and get the oil physically flowing out of the caverns and into pipelines or onto barges.
Okay. And what about putting oil back into the SPR after a release? Do they have to refill it?
The decision on when and how to refill rests with the administration. The DOE is supposed to consider factors like supporting domestic production, national security, trying to buy when prices are lower to minimize cost to taxpayers, and avoiding disrupting the market with their purchases. It's a balancing act.
So what's the level right now? How much oil is actually in the U.S. SPR today?
The Investopedia source stated that as of January 31st, 2025, the inventory was about 394.8 million barrels.
Okay, down quite a bit from its maximum capacity then, partly due to those recent releases.
Correct.
So putting it all together, if you take our proven reserves in the U.S. and add the current SPR level, how long could that theoretically last us based on how much we use?
Okay, let's do some rough math based on the Investopedia numbers. They cited U.S. proved reserves at the end of 2022 as about 48.3 billion barrels.
Right.
And current U.S. consumption is estimated around 20.25 million barrels per day. So if you divide the reserves by daily consumption, that 48.3 billion barrels works out to roughly 2,385 days, or about 6.5 years.
6.5 years just from proven reserves, assuming constant consumption and no imports.
Exactly, a very hypothetical scenario. Now, add the SPR, that 394.8 million barrels divided by 20.25 million barrels per day consumption. That adds about another 19.5 days.
So not a huge addition in the grand scheme of things, but maybe crucial in a short-term crisis.
That's precisely the idea behind the SPR. It's a buffer for emergencies, not a long-term supply solution.
Right. Okay, this brings us to the final piece, which influences almost everything we've discussed. Oil prices. They're notoriously volatile. We know supply and demand are key, but what else makes prices swing so wildly? That Econ Journal's paper looked into this, didn't it?
It did, yeah. It investigated the causes behind high crude prices over the last few decades and confirmed what many suspect. It's way more complex than just simple supply meets demand.
What kind of other factors?
Things like speculation, financial bets on future prices, political instability in major oil-producing regions, natural disasters that knock out production or refineries, and interestingly, the value of the U.S. dollar.
The dollar's exchange rate, how does that affect oil prices? That's not immediately obvious.
Well, the study found a pretty significant negative correlation, meaning when the U.S. dollar gets stronger against other currencies, oil prices tend to go down.
Why would that be?
Think about it. Oil is mostly priced in U.S. dollars globally. So if the dollar is strong, it costs more in terms of other currencies for countries like Japan or in Europe to buy that dollar-denominated oil. That can dampen demand, pushing prices down.
Ah, okay. And if the dollar is weak?
Then oil becomes relatively cheaper for buyers using other currencies, potentially boosting demand and pushing prices up. So yeah, the dollar's value is a surprisingly important factor.
What else did their model show? What seemed to be the biggest price drivers?
Their structural model suggested that demand-side factors generally had a bigger impact than pure supply-side ones.
Like consumption levels?
Exactly. Oil consumption in the big developed economies in the OECD countries, and specifically in the US and China, was very significant. Also, the level of oil inventories, or stocks.
High stocks mean lower prices?
Generally, yes. The paper found that higher oil stocks, both U.S. commercial stocks and overall OECD stocks, were strongly correlated with lower oil prices. It signals that supply is maybe outpacing immediate demand.
What about OPEC? Did their production quotas matter?
Interestingly, the study found a positive correlation between OPEC quotas and prices.
Positive? Wouldn't higher quotas mean more supply and lower prices?
You'd think so. But the researchers suggested this might reflect issues with members actually complying with quotas. If they announce higher quotas but don't fully deliver, the market might react negatively. Or perhaps the quotas are raised in response to already high prices. It wasn't the straightforward relationship one might expect.
And economic growth, like GDP.
That factored in too, but differently for different countries. China's GDP growth seemed to have an immediate positive impact on oil prices. More growth, more oil needed, higher prices. Makes sense.
And the U.S.?
For the U.S., it was more complex according to their model. A negative impact right away, but then a positive impact after about 3 months. The dynamics are intricate.
And those unpredictable shocks, wars, hurricanes.
They tried to capture those, using what's called a dummy variable for major geopolitical or climate events. And yes, they found a positive correlation. These kinds of disruptions tend to push prices up, usually due to fears about supply being interrupted or infrastructure being damaged.
Makes sense. Finally, the paper looked at how crude oil prices relate to natural gas prices.
It did, comparing Europe and the U.S.
What was the difference?
In Europe, they found Brent crude prices seemed to strongly influence natural gas prices at the major trading hubs there. A clear long-term link.
And in America, WTI oil and Henry Hub gas.
More complex. The evidence suggested WTI oil did influence Henry Hub gas prices up until around 2011.
What changed then? The shale gas boom.
That's the likely suspect, yeah. The huge increase in U.S. natural gas production kind of decoupled its price from oil to some extent, pushing gas prices way down. However, they still found evidence of a long-run underlying connection between WTI and Henry Hub. They even speculated that those lower U.S. natural gas prices might have helped keep WTI oil prices from going even higher than they might have otherwise.
Fascinating interplay between different energy markets. Wow. Okay, that was a lot. We've covered a huge amount of ground here.
We really have. And I think the key thing to take away from all this is that oil reserves aren't just some simple number you can look up. It's a really complex and constantly shifting concept.
Yeah, definitely not static.
Right. It's shaped by geology, sure, but also by technology, by economics, what price makes it worth getting out, and of course by politics and global events. Understanding how we define reserves, where they are, how we estimate their longevity, and especially what drives the price. It's just crucial in today's world.
Absolutely. That interplay between the physical resource, the technology, the market, environmental concerns, strategic stockpiles, it creates this incredibly dynamic picture.
With huge implications for, well, pretty much the entire global economy.
That's a fantastic summary. And it leaves me with maybe one final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. We know oil is finite, right? And the world is increasingly looking towards alternative energy. So how might the definition and the sheer importance we place on proven oil reserves change in the decades ahead?
Good question.
Could those currently unproven or unconventional resources become more critical? Or will entirely new energy sources just fundamentally reshape how we think about energy security and global power dynamics, making today's reserve maps look quaint.
It's definitely something to think about.
It is. This deep dive is really just a snapshot of a conversation that's going to keep evolving. And hopefully, having listened today, your perspective on it is that much more informed. Thanks for joining us.